Judge Richard Thompson sat in his new chambers, his fingers tracing the nameplate on his desk. His name, followed by the word judge, looked strange yet wonderful to him. At 58, after 30 years as a prosecutor, his appointment to the federal bench was the crowning achievement of his career. The office still smelled of fresh paint. The walls were bare except for his law degree and a family photo. Richard picked up the picture, smiling at the image of his wife, Susan, and their 2 adult children. Susan had been his rock through law school, the long nights as a junior prosecutor, and the political maneuvering required to secure this appointment. Judge Thompson, his new assistant, Megan, appeared at the doorway. "Your wife called. She wanted to remind you about dinner tonight. She said everything is ready for the celebration." Richard nodded, glancing at his watch. The swearing-in ceremony had ended just 45 minutes ago. Susan had insisted on hosting a small party at their home for close friends and family. He had wanted something quiet, but Susan believed important moments deserved proper celebration. "Thank you, Megan. I'll be heading out shortly." He began organizing the congratulatory cards that had flooded his desk. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and old friends. The governor had sent a handwritten note, which Richard carefully placed in his briefcase to show Susan later. Outside, dark clouds gathered. The weather report had mentioned possible storms, and Richard hoped the rain would hold off until after their guests arrived. He called Susan as he packed up his things. "I'm leaving now," he told her when she answered. Her voice sounded excited and a little stressed, the way it always did when she hosted events. "Perfect timing. The caterers just finished setting up. Your favorite whiskey is ready for a toast, and I picked up that cheese you love." Susan's voice softened. "I'm so proud of you, Richard. You've worked so hard for this." "We've worked hard," he corrected her. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Drive safely. It's starting to rain here." Richard ended the call and slipped his phone into his pocket. He took one last look around his chambers, still not quite believing this was his new professional home. Judge Thompson. The title felt heavy with responsibility. His colleague, Judge Martinez, appeared at his door. "Not staying late on your first day? Good man, the files will still be here tomorrow." "Susan's arranged a celebration," Richard explained, shaking his friend's hand. "You're welcome to stop by if you'd like. Maybe for a quick drink. Congratulations again, Richard. The bench suits you." As Richard walked to his car in the parking garage, several court employees stopped to congratulate him. He thanked them all, feeling a mix of pride and humility. The journey to this position had been long, with plenty of obstacles along the way. In his car, Richard loosened his tie and started the engine. The first drops of rain hit his windshield as he pulled out of the garage. Traffic was heavier than usual due to the approaching storm. He turned on the radio, where a weather alert warned of flash flooding in some areas. Richard took his usual road home, the one he had driven almost daily for 15 years. The Harrison Bridge stretched across the river, connecting downtown with the suburban area where he and Susan lived. The bridge was showing its age, with repairs scheduled to begin the following month. As he approached the bridge, the rain intensified. His wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. Richard slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Several cars ahead had their hazard lights on. Meanwhile, at home, Susan moved around their dining room, adjusting flower arrangements and wine glasses. Their son had called to say he might be late due to the weather. Their daughter was already there, helping with final preparations. "Mom, where should I put these name cards?" their daughter, Emily, asked. Susan didn't answer. She stood perfectly still by the window, one hand pressed against her chest. "Mom?" Emily approached her, noticing her mother's suddenly pale face. "Are you okay?" "I feel." Susan couldn't finish her sentence. She collapsed into a chair, breathing heavily. Emily rushed to her side. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Call an ambulance," Susan whispered, her voice strained. "Something's not right." As Emily frantically dialed 911, Richard's car reached the middle of the Harrison Bridge. The rain was now a blinding downpour. Through the sheets of water, he didn't see the large crack that had appeared in the road ahead, where the aging bridge was finally giving way after years of stress and insufficient maintenance. No one could have predicted what would happen next. Richard's car crawled through the heavy rain as he crossed the Harrison Bridge. The wipers swept frantically across his windshield, but they were no match for the downpour. His phone rang through the car's speakers. "Dad?" It was Emily. Something in her voice made his heart skip a beat. "Emily? What's wrong?" Richard's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Tell her I'm coming. I'm on the bridge now. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Please hurry, Dad." The call ended, and Richard pressed his foot harder on the accelerator. The rain showed no signs of letting up. Visibility was poor, but his mind was no longer on the weather. All he could think about was Susan. They had met in college, two ambitious students with big dreams. She had supported his decision to go to law school, working extra shifts to help pay the bills. When he joined the prosecutor's office, she had been there through every difficult case, every late night. Their 35 years together flashed through his mind as he navigated through the storm. Ahead of him, a car swerved suddenly. Richard squinted through the rain and saw what had caused the driver to react. A large crack had appeared in the road surface. He slowed down, steering carefully around it. The bridge groaned beneath him, a sound barely audible over the pounding rain, but one that sent a chill through his body. Something was wrong. Back at home, the paramedics had arrived and were attending to Susan. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking her vital signs and asking questions. "How long has she been experiencing chest pain?" one paramedic asked Emily. "Just a few minutes before I called you. She was fine all day, preparing for my dad's celebration." Emily held her mother's hand tightly. Susan's face was contorted with pain, but she managed to speak. "Is Richard here yet?" "He's on his way, Mom. He's coming as fast as he can." The lead paramedic looked concerned as he listened to Susan's heart. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately. It might be a cardiac event." Emily nodded, fighting back tears. "I'll call my brother. He's on his way here too." As the paramedics prepared to move Susan to the ambulance, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows of the house. The storm was intensifying. On the bridge, Richard noticed other drivers pulling over, their hazard lights blinking in the gray haze. Then he heard it again, that deep, structural groan. This time, it was followed by a sharp crack that seemed to come from below. Richard's phone rang again. It was Emily. "Dad, they're taking Mom to Memorial Hospital. It might be her heart. Where are you?" "Still on the bridge," Richard replied, his voice tight with worry. "There's something wrong here. Cars are stopping." As if in response to his words, the bridge gave another, more violent shudder. Richard felt his car tilt slightly to the left. "Dad, what's happening?" "I think," Richard began, but he never finished his sentence. With a deafening roar, a section of the Harrison Bridge, weakened by years of neglect and the final insult of the pounding rain, collapsed. Richard's car, along with 3 others, plunged toward the churning river below. In his final seconds, Richard's thoughts were of Susan. How strange that on this day, the day that should have been their triumph, they would both be fighting for their lives in completely different circumstances. At the hospital, Susan was rushed into emergency surgery. A team of doctors worked frantically to repair what they quickly diagnosed as an aortic dissection, a tear in the main artery carrying blood from her heart. It was a condition she had been born with, a ticking time bomb that had chosen this day to detonate. Emily and her brother, Michael, who had arrived at the hospital directly, sat in the waiting room, unaware of the tragedy unfolding at the Harrison Bridge. Michael kept trying to call their father, but the calls went straight to voicemail. He must still be driving, Michael reasoned, attempting to stay calm for his sister's sake. In this weather, he's probably just focused on the road. A nurse approached them with a grim expression. "The doctor will be out to speak with you shortly about your mother." Just then, breaking news flashed on the waiting room television. The volume was low, but the images were unmistakable. The Harrison Bridge had partially collapsed. Emergency vehicles surrounded the scene, and rescue boats searched the waters below. Emily stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. "Michael, Dad was on that bridge." As the siblings stared at the television in horror, the doctor emerged from the operating room, his surgical mask pulled down, his eyes carrying the weight of what he had to tell them about their mother. 30 minutes after Richard Thompson's proud appointment as judge, both he and his wife Susan faced destinies that no one could have predicted. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital burst into action as doctors and nurses rushed to save Susan Thompson's life. The The surgical team worked with intense focus, their hands steady despite the urgency of the situation. Blood pressure dropping, called out a nurse. The lead surgeon, Dr. Patel, didn't look up from his work. More blood now. We need to repair this tear before she bleeds out. Meanwhile, at the Harrison Bridge, rescue workers battled the raging storm and rising waters. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars lined the intact portion of the bridge, their lights cutting through the rain in red and blue flashes. "We spotted a vehicle," shouted one of the rescue divers through his radio. "About 30 feet down, driver's side up. Attempting to access now." Police Chief Roberts coordinated from the shore, his raincoat offering little protection against the downpour. "Any sign of survivors?" "Not yet, sir," came the crackled response. "The current's strong. We're having trouble reaching the vehicles." As both rescue efforts continued, Emily and Michael Thompson sat in the hospital waiting room, gripped by a nightmare that seemed impossible. Their mother was fighting for her life in surgery. Their father was potentially trapped in the river below the collapsed bridge. Michael paced back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, my father is Judge Richard Thompson. He was driving a black Lexus sedan. You would have been on the bridge around 5:30 p.m., his voice cracked. "Please, you have to find him." Emily sat frozen, staring at the television where news footage showed rescue boats circling the disaster site. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "Not both of them. Not today." A social worker approached them with cups of coffee. "Is there anyone else we can call for you?" she asked gently. Before either could answer, Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway, still wearing his surgical gown. His face was lined with exhaustion. "The Thompson family?" he asked, though he clearly knew who they were. Michael and Emily stood together, bracing for whatever news he brought. "Your mother's condition was extremely critical," Dr. Patel began. "The tear in her aorta was massive. In medical terms, she suffered what we call an acute aortic dissection. Essentially, the inner layer of her aorta tore, allowing blood to flow between the layers and forcing them apart." "But you fixed it, right?" Emily asked, her voice small. Dr. Patel's expression softened. "We did everything humanly possible. The surgery itself was successful, but the damage to her heart from the initial tear and the stress of the procedure." He paused. "I'm very sorry. Your mother passed away a few minutes ago." The words hit them like physical blows. Michael reached for his sister as she began to collapse. "No," Emily sobbed. "No, please." As they clung to each other, a police officer appeared in the waiting room. His uniform was soaked, and his face carried the grim expression of someone with more bad news to deliver. "Michael and Emily Thompson?" he asked. Michael nodded, still holding his sister. "I'm Officer Daniels from the River Rescue Unit. We've located your father's vehicle." At that moment, the hospital's emergency entrance doors burst open as paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. The person on it was barely visible beneath medical equipment and the hands of the paramedics continuing CPR. Male, late 50s, cardiac arrest, pulled from submerged vehicle at the Harrison Bridge collapse. One paramedic shouted as they raced past the waiting room. Emily broke free from her brother's grip. "Dad," she screamed, recognizing a glimpse of her father's face as the stretcher disappeared down the hallway. Officer Daniels gently caught her arm. "Your father was underwater for nearly 20 minutes. The divers got him out as quickly as they could, but what?" Michael demanded. The rescue team started CPR immediately, but there was no pulse at the scene. The officer explained quietly. "They're still trying, but you should prepare yourselves for." He didn't finish his sentence. He didn't need to. Within the span of a single hour, what should have been the proudest day of the Thompson family had turned into an unimaginable tragedy. A hidden heart condition and a neglected bridge, two separate failures that had nothing to do with each other, had converged on this rainy evening to claim both Richard and Susan Thompson. In the trauma room, doctors worked frantically over Richard's still form, but their efforts were already shifting from resuscitation to formality. The hospital chaplain was quietly summoned to be with the family. Out in the waiting room, Emily turned to her brother, her face streaked with tears. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "Mom and Dad. Both of them, on the same day?" Michael had no answer. Some tragedies were simply beyond explanation. The hospital corridor fell silent as Dr. Wilson emerged from the trauma room. His face told the story before his words could. Michael and Emily stood together, clutching each other's hands so tightly their knuckles had turned white. "I'm deeply sorry," Dr. Wilson said, his voice gentle but direct. "We did everything we could to revive your father. The time he spent underwater was simply too long. He suffered cardiac arrest and significant brain damage from oxygen deprivation. So he's—" Michael couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. "Yes," Dr. Wilson confirmed. "Your father passed away at 6:42 p.m. I'm so very sorry for your loss." The clock on the wall seemed to mock them. It had been exactly 2 hours since their father's swearing-in ceremony as a federal judge. Now, both their parents were gone. Outside the hospital, the storm continued to rage, as if nature itself was mourning. News crews had gathered, broadcasting live updates about the bridge collapse and the emerging details about the newly appointed judge who had been one of its victims. Back inside, Pastor Roberts from the Thompson family's church arrived, having heard the news. He found Michael and Emily sitting in a private waiting room, surrounded by hospital staff and police officers. "My dear children," he said, embracing them both, "I came as soon as I heard." Emily looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "They're both gone, Pastor. Mom and Dad. Both of them. On the same day." The pastor sat beside them. "Sometimes there are no words," he said softly. "Sometimes all we can do is be present in the pain." Officer Daniels, who had remained with them, cleared his throat. "I know this is an unimaginably difficult time, but there are some details I need to share with you about the bridge collapse." Michael nodded, though his eyes seemed unfocused. "What happened?" "The bridge was old, but it was still in use. There were no warnings." "That's what we're investigating," Officer Daniels explained. "Early reports suggest that heavy rainfall caused a critical weakness in the support structure to finally give way. The bridge had been flagged for major repairs, but bureaucratic delays meant those repairs hadn't started yet. So it was preventable." Michael's voice took on an edge. "My father died because someone didn't do their job." The officer looked uncomfortable. "The investigation is ongoing, but there will be serious questions about the maintenance schedule and inspection reports." As they spoke, Dr. Paddle returned to the room. "I wanted to explain something about your mother's condition, if you're ready to hear it." Emily nodded weakly. "Your mother had what we call a congenital aortic defect. She was born with a weakness in her aortic wall. Many people live their entire lives with this condition and never know it. But in moments of extreme stress or emotion, like today," Emily whispered, "the excitement of Dad's appointment." "Yes," Dr. Paddle confirmed. "The increased heart rate and blood pressure can cause the weakened area to tear. It's rare, but when it happens, it's often catastrophic." "Could it have been detected?" Michael asked. "With specific cardiac imaging, yes, but these tests aren't routine unless there's a family history or symptoms." Dr. Paddle paused. "I understand this is overwhelming information at an already devastating time." Hospital social worker Ms. Grayson entered the room with 2 cups of tea. "We prepared a quiet room where you can make calls to family members. When you're ready, we'll need to discuss some practical matters that can wait until tomorrow if you prefer." As they sipped their tea in silence, a nurse approached with a small plastic bag. "These are your father's personal belongings that were recovered from the scene." Michael took the bag with trembling hands. Inside was their father's waterlogged wallet, his keys, and his phone, damaged beyond repair. Most poignant of all was the nameplate that had been on his desk just that morning: Judge Richard Thompson. "He was so proud," Emily said, touching the nameplate. "He worked his whole life for this." Outside their room, the hospital corridors bustled with activity. Other families dealt with their own medical emergencies, unaware of the extraordinary coincidence that had struck the Thompson family. In the span of 30 minutes, both Richard and Susan Thompson had experienced separate, unrelated medical catastrophes: a hidden heart defect and a crumbling bridge. 2 disasters with nothing in common except their timing had converged to create a tragedy so unlikely that it seemed almost impossible. As reporters gathered information for the next day's headlines, no one could have imagined the cruel twist of fate that had befallen the Thompson family. The story would soon shock the entire nation, 30 minutes after his appointment as judge, the man and his wife had died, for reasons no one could have predicted. The morning after the tragedy, the city woke to front-page headlines and breaking news alerts. Newly appointed judge and wife die in separate tragedies, read the banner headline of the Daily Chronicle. News vans lined the street outside the Thompson home, where neighbors had begun to leave flowers and candles. Detective Sarah Martinez pulled up to the Harrison Bridge disaster site, flashing her badge at the officer controlling access. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, and structural engineers in hard hats examined what remained of the bridge. The rain had stopped, but the river below still rushed violently. Detective Chief Inspector Wilson greeted her. "Glad you're taking lead on this. It's going to be high profile." Martinez nodded grimly. "The coincidence is almost unbelievable. Judge Thompson dies in the bridge collapse while his wife dies of a heart condition at almost the exact same time." "That's why we need to be thorough," Wilson said, handing her a file. "The mayor is already facing questions about the bridge maintenance schedule, and there will be lawsuits." Martinez opened the file, scanning the preliminary reports. The bridge was last inspected 8 months ago. Yes, and flagged for urgent repairs, but funding was delayed in committee meetings. Wilson's face hardened. Politics as usual until something like this happens. "But she never had any symptoms," Michael said. "She was active, healthy. That's not uncommon with this condition. People can live their entire lives without knowing they have it." Dr. Keller removed his glasses. "The emotional excitement of your father's appointment likely caused a sudden spike in blood pressure, which triggered the dissection." Michael stared at his hands. "So it was just bad luck? Both of them dying like that?" "Medically speaking, yes. The timing is an extraordinary coincidence." Across town, Emily Thompson sat in the office of James Wilson, her parents' attorney. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a tissue in her hand. "I know this is difficult timing," Wilson said kindly, "but there are matters that need attention. Your parents' will is straightforward. Everything is divided equally between you and your brother." Emily nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. "There's something else," Wilson continued, his tone changing slightly. "Your father came to see me last week. He mentioned he was concerned about something related to his appointment." Emily focused on him suddenly. "What do you mean? What was he concerned about?" "He didn't go into details. He just said if anything happened to him, I should look into the Martinson case." "The Martinson case?" Emily repeated. "What's that?" "It was a major corruption case your father prosecuted about 5 years ago. Several city officials went to prison." Wilson hesitated. "I'm not suggesting anything, but I felt I should tell you." Back at the bridge, Detective Martinez interviewed the chief engineer from the Department of Infrastructure. The support cables showed significant corrosion, the engineer explained, pointing to photographs. "Water had been seeping into the protective housing for years. We flagged this in our report last year." "And nothing was done?" Martinez asked. "Budget cuts. The repair was approved but then postponed when other projects took priority." Martinez made notes in her book. "I'll need all the inspection reports, maintenance records, and committee meeting minutes related to this bridge for the past 5 years." As the detective continued her investigation, local television stations ran special reports on the tragedy. News anchors spoke in solemn tones as they recounted Richard Thompson's distinguished career and the shocking circumstances of his death alongside his wife's. "Sources tell us," one reporter said gravely, "that the Thompson family is considering legal action against the city for negligence regarding the bridge maintenance." Meanwhile, medical experts are discussing whether Mrs. Thompson's condition could have been detected earlier. By evening, the story had gone national. The improbable coincidence of a newly appointed judge and his wife dying of completely unrelated causes within minutes of each other had captured public attention. As Michael and Emily sat in their parents' home, surrounded by casseroles brought by well-meaning neighbors, they struggled to make sense of the senseless. "Dad mentioned something about the Martinson case to you," Michael asked his sister. "That's what his lawyer said. Do you think it means something?" Michael stared at the wall of family photos. "I don't know, but I think we owe it to them to find out." As night fell on the city, 2 separate investigations were just beginning. One official, one private. Both sought answers to the same question: was the double tragedy truly just a cruel coincidence, Or was there more to the story than anyone realized? 3 days after the tragedy, Detective Martinez sat at her desk surrounded by stacks of documents. Bridge inspection reports, maintenance logs, and budget meeting minutes created a paper maze around her. She rubbed her tired eyes as her partner, Detective Rodriguez, placed a coffee on her desk. "Find anything interesting?" Rodriguez asked. "Maybe." Martinez pulled out a document. "Look at this. The final budget approval for the Harrison Bridge repairs was delayed 3 times in the past year, each time by the same committee. The Infrastructure Oversight Committee." Rodriguez read over her shoulder. "Yes, and guess who sat on that committee? Councilman Victor Martinson." Martinez's eyes narrowed. "The same Martinson whose brother went to prison in that corruption case Judge Thompson prosecuted 5 years ago." Rodriguez whistled low. "That's quite a connection. Think it's relevant?" "I don't know yet, but Judge Thompson told his lawyer he was concerned about the Martinson case just before he died." She reached for her phone. "I need to speak with the Thompson children again." Across town, Emily and Michael Thompson were at their parents' house, sorting through personal belongings. The funeral was scheduled for tomorrow, and distant relatives had begun arriving in town. "What should we do with Dad's case files?" Emily asked, gesturing to the home office where boxes of legal documents were stacked neatly. Michael opened one box. "Most of these should probably go to his office at the courthouse, but his lawyer mentioned the Martinson case, right? Maybe we should look for that one." They searched through several boxes before Emily found a thick file labeled Martinson et al. Versus State. She opened it on their father's desk, and they began skimming through the pages. "This was a big case," Michael said. "Dad prosecuted 7 city officials for taking bribes from developers. All of them went to prison." Emily pointed to a passage. "Look at this. One of the defendants, Robert Martinson, threatened Dad during sentencing. He said, 'You'll pay for this, Thompson. Maybe not today, but someday.'" "That's pretty standard stuff for angry defendants," Michael said. "But still." Their conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Detective Martinez stood on the porch. "Sorry to disturb you during this difficult time," she said when they invited her in. "I have some questions about something your father mentioned before his death." Emily nodded. "The Martinson case? We were just looking through the file." Martinez seemed surprised. "Yes, exactly. What do you know about it?" They showed her the file and explained what their father's lawyer had told them. "There's something else you should see," Michael said, pulling out his laptop. "I've been going through Dad's emails. He had an exchange with a reporter last month about possible connections between the bridge repair delays and some of the people involved in the Martinson case." Martinez leaned forward. "What kind of connections?" "The company that was supposed to do the bridge repairs is owned by James Wilson." "The lawyer?" Martinez asked. "No, different Wilson. This one is a contractor who donated heavily to Councilman Martinson's campaigns. Dad suspected the repairs were being deliberately delayed to award the contract to a different company, one with ties to the Martinson family." Martinez took notes rapidly. "This could change the entire investigation. The bridge collapse might not have been simple negligence but deliberate obstruction." "But that doesn't explain Mom's death," Emily said quietly. "That was just a medical condition." "True," Martinez agreed. "Unless." "Unless what?" Michael asked. Martinez hesitated. "It would be unusual, but I'd like permission to review your mother's medical records, just to be thorough." The siblings exchanged glances before nodding their agreement. Later that afternoon, Martinez met with Dr. Keller at the medical examiner's office. "I've reviewed Susan Thompson's autopsy results again," Dr. Keller said. "Her aortic dissection appears completely natural, a genetic weakness that finally gave way." "Could it have been induced somehow?" Martinez asked. "A medication or substance that would raise blood pressure dramatically." Dr. Keller looked thoughtful. "It's possible. Certain stimulants could trigger a rupture in someone with her condition. We didn't run a full toxicology panel since there was no suspicion of foul play." "I'd like one run now," Martinez said. As the day of the funeral arrived, the small city was abuzz with speculation. News reports began connecting dots between the bridge collapse, Judge Thompson's previous cases, and the suspicious timing of events. In the church, hundreds gathered to pay respects to the couple. City officials sat in the front rows, their faces appropriately solemn. Among them was Councilman Victor Martinson, who offered his condolences to Michael and Emily. The cemetery was quiet after the funeral. Most mourners had departed, leaving only Michael and Emily standing by their parents' fresh graves. Detective Martinez approached slowly, giving them time to notice her presence. "I received some information that I need to share with you," she said gently, "but not here. Can we meet at your parents' house in an hour?" Michael nodded, his face drawn with grief and exhaustion. "Is it about what we discussed?" "Yes," Martinez replied, "and it changes everything." 1 hour later, Martinez sat at the Thompsons' dining room table. She placed a folder in front of the siblings. "The medical examiner found traces of a synthetic stimulant in your mother's bloodstream," she explained. "It's not common, and it wouldn't show up in routine tests, but it's known to cause extreme spikes in blood pressure." Emily covered her mouth. "So someone poisoned her?" "It appears that way," Martinez confirmed. "The stimulant was likely in something she consumed shortly before her collapse. Given her pre-existing heart condition, it would have been effectively untraceable without the specific tests we ran." "But who would do this?" Michael asked, his voice rising. "And why both of them?" "The bridge collapse was no accident either," Martinez interrupted. "I've obtained emails between Councilman Martinson and the head of city maintenance. They deliberately postponed critical repairs despite urgent warnings from engineers." The siblings sat in stunned silence. "So the Martinson connection is real," Michael finally said. Martinez nodded. "Your father was building a case. After the corruption trial 5 years ago, he continued to investigate the Martinson family quietly. According to his notes, which we found in his office computer, he believed they had infiltrated other parts of the city government. And his appointment as federal judge would have given him more power to investigate," Emily realized. "Exactly. Your father was scheduled to oversee several cases that would have exposed their network." Martinez tapped her folder. "We believe Councilman Martinson learned about your father's investigation and took steps to silence him. But why kill Mom too?" Emily asked, tears filling her eyes. "Based on what we pieced together, your mother wasn't supposed to die," Martinez explained. "The plan was likely to make your father's death look like an accident while creating a distraction with your mother's illness. They probably intended for her to be hospitalized but recover. The stimulant they used was more potent than they realized." Michael stood up suddenly, his fists clenched. "So they murdered both our parents over politics and money." "Corruption on this scale is about power," Martinez said quietly. "Your father threatened that power." The detective opened her laptop and played a video recording. "This is from a security camera at your parents' house. It shows someone approaching during the preparation for the celebration, while your mother was alone in the kitchen for a few minutes." The grainy footage showed a man in catering uniform entering through the side door. He moved to the counter where drinks were set up, added something to one glass, and then left quickly. "We've identified him as Tony Ramirez, a former associate of Robert Martinson who was released from prison last year," Martinez explained. "We arrested him this morning. He's already talking, looking for a deal." Emily wiped her tears. "What about the bridge? How could they ensure Dad would be on it at that exact time?" "They couldn't," Martinez said, "but they knew his route home. The bridge was rigged to fail. They used the storm as cover to trigger the collapse remotely when they confirmed he was on the bridge." "How did they know?" Michael asked. "Your father's car was being tracked. We found a device underneath it when we recovered the vehicle." Martinez closed her folder. "We're preparing to arrest Councilman Martinson tonight, along with 3 other city officials." The siblings sat in silence as they absorbed the shocking truth. Their parents' deaths were not a tragic coincidence but a calculated murder plot, one that had partially backfired when Susan Thompson died unexpectedly. "What happens now?" Emily finally asked. "We need your help," Martinez said. "Your father kept detailed records. Some may be here in the house. We need everything you can find about the Martinson case or any other corruption investigations he was working on." Michael's expression hardened with resolve. "We'll find everything. Dad always said that justice might be slow, but it's inevitable." As they began searching through their father's home office, news alerts appeared on their phones. The headline read, "Breaking. multiple city officials to be arrested in connection with Judge Thompson's death. 6 months after the deaths of Richard and Susan Thompson, the city courthouse was packed with reporters, citizens, and family members. The trial of Councilman Victor Martinson and his associates had reached its final day. Michael and Emily Thompson sat in the front row, their faces showing the strain of the past half-year. Judge Harriet Williams looked down from the bench at the defendants. "The jury has reached a verdict. Please stand." Martinson rose slowly, his once confident demeanor now replaced with nervous exhaustion. Beside him stood his chief of staff, the former head of city maintenance, Antonio Ramirez, the man who had put the deadly stimulant in Susan Thompson's drink. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman stood. "On the count of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree of Judge Richard Thompson, we find the defendant, Victor Martinson, guilty." A murmur swept through the courtroom. "On the count of involuntary manslaughter in the death of Susan Thompson, we find the defendant, Victor Martinson, guilty." Emily gripped her brother's hand tightly. The foreman continued reading through the verdicts for all defendants. Each was found guilty on multiple counts ranging from murder to corruption, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Judge Williams nodded solemnly. "Sentencing will be held in 2 weeks. The defendants will remain in custody until that time." She banged her gavel. "Court is adjourned." Outside on the courthouse steps, Detective Martinez approached the Thompson siblings as reporters clamored for statements. "Your father would be proud," she said quietly. "This case has exposed corruption at every level of the city government. 5 more officials resigned this morning, and the federal investigation is ongoing." Michael nodded. "It doesn't bring Mom and Dad back, but at least there's justice." "And reform," Emily added. "The new infrastructure safety bill is named after them." The Thompson Bridge Safety Act had been passed by the state legislature just weeks earlier. It created stricter inspection requirements for public infrastructure and established an independent oversight committee that couldn't be influenced by local politics. Later that evening, Michael and Emily visited their parents' graves. The setting sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as they placed fresh flowers on the matching headstones. "It's still hard to believe," Emily said softly. "All because Dad was doing his job." "He always said that powerful people would do anything to protect themselves," Michael replied. "I just never thought it would cost him and Mom their lives." As they stood in silent reflection, James Wilson, their parents' attorney, joined them with a solemn nod. "I have something your father wanted you to have," he said, handing them a sealed envelope. "He left it with me with instructions to give it to you if his concerns about the Martinson case proved justified." Michael took the envelope with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a letter in their father's handwriting and a small USB drive. "My dear children," Michael read aloud, "if you're reading this, then my suspicions were correct, and something has happened to me. The enclosed drive contains evidence of corruption that goes beyond Martinson and reaches into state government. I've spent years gathering this information, and I trust you to know what to do with it. Your mother always said that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always right. I love you both. Dad." Emily stared at the USB drive. "There's more? Even after everything that's come out?" Wilson nodded. "Your father was thorough. He believed the Martinson family was just the visible part of a much larger network." The next morning, Emily and Michael met with Detective Martinez and Federal Prosecutor Helen Chang in a secure office at the FBI building. "This evidence is extraordinary," Chang said after reviewing the contents of the drive. Judge Thompson had documented connections between the Martinson family and 3 state-level officials, including a federal judge. "What happens now?" Michael asked. "We open a new investigation," Martinez replied. "Your father's work continues." 1 year to the day after Richard and Susan Thompson's deaths, a memorial was unveiled at the site of the rebuilt Harrison Bridge. City residents gathered to see the bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Judge Richard Thompson and Susan Thompson, whose tragic deaths led to reforms that will save countless lives. Truth will always prevail." Emily stepped forward to address the crowd. "My parents believed in justice and doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Their deaths exposed corruption that had infected our city for decades. Today, we have stricter building codes, independent oversight of infrastructure, and a city government committed to transparency.